Hey there, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to Art of Sacred Embodiment. It's Lotus on this beautiful day. So, I hope this finds everybody well. And we're going to talk today about consent. And we're going to talk about the subtleties of consent. We're going to talk about the overview of that. And then when we start the Remembering Your Wholeness classes that are going to start next week, we're going to be weaving consent and the topic and the experience and expressions and the reasons why our consent is really growing in greater importance and why that consent is part and parcel with our maturation process and also really managing our energetics as well and utilizing our empowerment of choice. So that is going to be starting on Wednesday. There will be a link down below that is highlighting that class in particular. It's going to be ongoing. So if you can join, that would be awesome. So let's talk a little bit about consent and why this is important as we grow and mature along our spiritual journey. Why it's important in general, really, and what does that really mean by consent? There are overt things that we, I think, automatically think of as giving our consent. Some of those things may just be when we need to place boundaries, right? Set boundaries. We know something isn't aligned with us, something isn't okay with us, something isn't sitting right with us, somebody's trespassing, you know, our body, our emotions, maybe our physical space. Those are a little bit more obvious ways that we can begin to recognize consent. And most of us are probably practicing that all the time. Where this gets a little bit more interesting, right, is the energetic consent. And along the spiritual journey, because things become less seen, right, we're working with unseen realms. We're working with unseen energies. We're working and interacting with different dimensional frequencies. And everything in the spiritual realms doesn't necessarily mean that we want to be interacting with it, right? Because there are lower frequencies and the ways that lower frequencies operate, and it's just their nature, right? It's just their nature. And the ways that higher frequencies operate, because that is that nature. And I'm going to use a couple examples in a minute personally for when I started recognizing more clearly what I was giving consent to, or when I started realizing that there are things in both our physical world and the spiritual realms that don't necessarily wait for our consent or ask for our consent. They take it as if we are not saying yes or no, that it may enter our field. And one of the easiest ways to see this really is just everything out in the world, right, carries a consciousness, carries a vibration, carries frequency, carries information. And we go along in the physical realm and we're taking in so much information all of the time, both seen and unseen. Some of it is very subliminal, and it enters in, right? It's like we're kind of like these sponges. The less conscious we are, meaning the less awake, the less aware, the less present, i.e., the more distracted, the more scattered. And then that also goes into the more soul presence that we have, the more grounded, the more embodied we are, the more present we are. The less, or during phases and stages, right, times when maybe we're more stressed, maybe we're more highly stimulated, we tend to not be as embodied energetically with our power, with our spiritual power, with our soul power, with our deeper power. So when we're a little bit more fragmented, or when we have leaks, for instance, in our aura or in our energy field, then there are levels of consciousness that just sort of take advantage of that, right? We could just say that they're kind of like bottom feeders, or they're a little bit more predatory. But if we don't know about it, then we don't really know what we're interacting with. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that. We'll probably do a class on that because it is a really important topic. And in general, I don't spend a lot of time in that realm of teaching, but we're going to do a little bit more of that in the Remembering Our Wholeness. Remembering these are important things for all of us to know on this journey. So one of the biggest ways that we take in information and where we automatically are giving consent simply because we are taking it in. Because we're just taking it in, that's consent. Okay? And we can do this with forms of entertainment. We can do this with even commercials, with music videos. My gosh, when I look back at some of the music videos that I loved, right, when, back in the day, they're filled with information. They're filled with the consciousness, the creative consciousness of the creators. And depending on where that creator's consciousness resides, we're going to be interacting with those thought forms and those energies, seen and unseen. And we see this in all sorts of entertainment. We see this in our movies. We see this in television shows. We see it in gaming. The gaming culture. There's all sorts of layers of consciousness within that. And I think I said music, right? So what ends up happening is if we aren't aware of what we're eating, right, what we're feeding on, what is feeding us, those frequencies then become a part of us, become a part of our consciousness, the density of it or the higher vibration of it. The density of it is going to carry more heaviness, a little bit more darkness, a little bit more, doesn't have to be good or bad, right or wrong, in right alignment, in right intention. For instance, I have one of my all-time favorite movies is, I believe, a masterpiece called Magnolia. And it is a very hard and intense and it's got a lot of pain and suffering in it because it is exploring a lot of deeper human experiences that are painful and the ramifications of that pain. Now, I won't watch that again, right? Because I don't need to, because I've been there, I've analyzed it. But back at the point and time where I was still working through a lot of my own shadow, I would watch it periodically with the intention of partaking in these topics and these themes and these energies in order to help me understand some of my own deeper shadow that maybe I hadn't quite been able to access. So I gave myself permission. I gave that consciousness or those expressions of consciousness permission into my system with the intention for my healing and for my upliftment. Now, that was very different than earlier phases of my life when that was sort of what I fed on unconsciously. Because unconsciously or subconsciously, there was healing that needed to happen. So I gravitated towards very specific themes and topics without understanding that I was putting myself kind of in the thick of those energies again and again and again. So I was increasing that density in my system because I was consenting without knowing to continuing to use that as my food source, right? My energetic nutrition, so to speak. It's like junk food because I wasn't doing it consciously. Then that shifted, and then I chose not to participate in those themes, those emotions, that density, because I no longer wanted to feel the pain and suffering again and again, because I had moved through that healing and it didn't feel good anymore. I was not vibrating at that place anymore. So we can use certain things as medicine when we're conscious. But if we are simply partaking in things that are just what we're used to, right? It's habit, it's what we're familiar with, it's what we know, then we aren't actually supporting our upliftment and raising our consciousness and remembering our wholeness. We might be continuing to fragment ourselves because we are giving consent unknowingly to a specific or specific vibrations, frequencies, consciousnesses. Now that's in a very physical way, right? In the physical, we're taking things in. We can do this spiritually as well, right? There are many of us who, especially early on in our journey, we're exploring everything, right? Everything, it's like, oh my gosh, there's this experience and there's this ceremony and there's this modality and there's, these different kind of windows into accessing higher dimensions or different dimensions. They may not even be higher dimensions. They may just be different dimensions that might still be denser and lower, and within those dimensionalities, there are going to be consciousnesses that then we end up probably letting attach to us. These are the subtleties that become really important along our journey to becoming sovereign beings, meaning we are unto ourselves. There's a deeper meanings to this, but let's just say we are unto ourselves, meaning we don't have a bunch of other influences that are not necessarily working for our highest good, or it's a level that might be a little bit higher than our highest good, and yet it may not be exactly the information, the guidance, the experiences, right, that are going to, that we're going to reap the fruits of truly coming into our divinity. Now, I'm gonna like segue back to the physical world for a minute, really quick. So I remember when my ex-husband and I were living in Los Angeles. Lots of different energies there. Um, if you've been to any of the big cities, you know, like LA, or if you live in big cities like this, or New York City, or, you know, Chicago, or any of these larger, really dense metropolitan areas, one of the things in LA is that there are huge billboards everywhere, right? They're lit up, they're advertising, right? So advertising is a really good example of when we're watching advertising and like, oh my gosh, I love that, right? It's not good or bad, right or wrong, but we want to know we're giving consent to that programming to to enter in and program us into specific desires. All right, let's just put it that way. Specific wants. Oh, I want that. Look how great and cool that looks. I want that. Right? So then we get hooked in to the marketing. Now, when we were in LA, because it was the movie industry, the billboards were very much entertainment and movie based. And over the 6 years that we lived there, what I started, like, really, as my frequency was raising and increasing, and as I was like gaining more of my own higher self embodiment and consciousness, I began to feel more keenly aware of the energies I did not want to take in. And that had to do with the primary billboards that were mostly, I would say 98% of the billboards that were inundating the consciousness of the demographics in that city had to do with horror, violence, and sex. And so as I started like really seeing that clear, I was like, wow, this is it. Like I would start noticing, right? I'd be like, like I became repelled. So the frequencies in my system were becoming repelled. And automatically my own soul presence and my higher self were rejecting it. So I would look away. Not because I was afraid, right? But because the frequencies weren't matching up. And it felt so overwhelmingly dense and icky. I had no interest in experiencing that. So as that continued to grow, that was one of the first indicators for me personally that this is not the environment that I want to be in anymore. Because if that's the predominant entertainment, not that that's the predominant entertainment consciousness necessarily per se, but if that is what the energetics are that are immersing the culture, then that is going to mean that the energetics of that environment as a city is going to be holding a lot of those codes. And that was the moment when it started really clicking on a physical level. I'd already kind of moved through a lot of my what I'm going to consent to on the spiritual level because I had to go through initiations, right? I had to go through learning curves where as I was raising my frequency, there were things that I didn't know how to not give consent to. I didn't know how to protect my energy and my space. So had to go through periods of time where I had to deal with some of these, darker bottom feeders. And that was also a strengthening of my spiritual resilience, mastery, and resolve. And recognizing what I will and will not give consent to. So anybody who does any work with me, or any activations or any classes, you're going to notice that the opening of every container that I work with, it's very clear. The only energies that I give consent to. I don't spend a lot of time saying what I don't consent to, because I don't really need to get into the division and the polarity. But what I do give time and energy to is this is only what is allowed in my consciousness, in my field, in my body, and in the container for the collective that I'm holding and working with. And that has been a part of my own maturation and mastery that has come through the understandings of the subtleties of consent. Now, there are many, there are many different archetypal forces in the world and in our realms, seen and unseen, that will take advantage if we don't know how to work with our consenting. What we say is appropriate and right and true and in our highest alignment, and what is the intentionality with which we're working with anything, right? Any practices, any teachers, any guides, any methods. And what is our intention for what we're working with? Is it for our evolution? Is it for, is it to come into more love? Is it to get closer to whatever God is to you? Is it to understand our divinity? Or is it just for experiences, right? Because things seem kind of cool and exciting, and particularly early on, those cool and exciting things, they hold a place in phases and stages. However, our spiritual path is about our spiritual development. It is about remembering truly the divinity that we are and our connection to life, right? The amazingness of life, the goodness of life, the powers of the divine. And it's a long journey and process. And we get to go through all of these stages. But if we don't understand the phases and stages and really the subtle layers that we're always navigating, then it's very easy to get tripped up. It's very easy to sort of stay circling at one level. And it's also easy to get confused about what it is that is actually calling us from the heart soul towards. What are we being called towards? What is the spiritual path actually for? What is our spiritual awakening actually for? And it's for everything that I mentioned and more. And as we go through our layers of, divine mastery and maturity, as we come into fuller soul embodiment and soul presencing, it gets simpler. It gets more direct and concise, and the path gets clearer. So this is a big part of what we're going to be really working with remembering your wholeness, right? It's that remembering our divinity. What does that mean? What does that mean? What is that experience, right? This is what we're learning. This is where we're going. And in order to keep moving into that higher expression, the lower levels will fall away. They need to fall away. So we give consent to less and less of our time, our attention, our energy. We don't allow as many things to pull us out. We become discerning, and we become more clear on why. Why am I watching this? Why am I listening to this? Why am I going here? Why am I practicing this? And am I practicing listening, going, because it's actually has purpose and meaning to my evolution and growth, rather than just because it's the thing to do, which again has its phase and stage, but then we graduate from that. So these are the subtleties, right? There are overarching themes to our spiritual maturation. And there are specific templates. So I talk a little bit about this in the blog that I just mentioned, that will talk about this class. I don't go into details, but there are common threads that are leading all of us through our unique path, through our unique expression, through our individual divine blueprint, that we can work with collectively as a group that will help you strengthen your own understanding of what is your unique path that is written within, and how do you not get distracted? How do you stay on point? How do you move into the higher states? And how do you know what you're giving consent to within your being, within the unseen, and within the seen? So I hope you join us, and you can message me below as well. Contact me if you have questions. Contact me if it's wondering, is this the right fit for me? And we'll be starting next Wednesday. So consent will be a part that will be woven throughout most of the classes, because it is becoming more and more important. All right. Many blessings, much love. See you soon.